The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Anti-Modernist Reader on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Matthew Gasson, and on this episode I'm joined by Father Cekada, Assistant Pastor at St. Gertrude the Great Parish, Westchester, Ohio. Hello, Father. Thank you for joining us.
Hi. Pleasure to be here.
In this episode, we're going to be discussing an article written by Father back in 1995 and again reproduced in 2006 that helps Catholics address the thorny issue of indefectibility. At some point, laity investigating traditional Catholicism will be confronted with an apparently Catholic hierarchy endowed with indefectibility, which is promulgating evil doctrines, disciplines, and liturgy to the entire Church. How is one to resolve this problem?
Well, this, as they say in America, was the $64,000 question that mystified Catholics from the beginning of the changes in the Church after the Second Vatican Council. Because, of course, those of us who were cradle Catholics in the old Church were brought up with the traditional understanding of the infallibility and indefectibility of the Church, that one could not ever say as a Catholic that the Church could teach you a false doctrine or that the Church could give you some sort of an evil discipline. That was inconceivable for us. So this was the big problem and the big issue from the beginning. When the Vatican II changes started to hit, we started to see all of these different all of these different terrible effects as far as loss of faith, irreverent treatment of the Blessed Sacrament, ecclesiastical discipline falling apart, etc. So, having the old principle of the infallibility and indefectibility of the Church in our heads, we sought an explanation. But it was very difficult to come by, and was not one that was immediately apparent to those of us who were struggling with this issue. So the understanding the nub of the problem is, on one hand, obviously evil disciplines and false teachings. On the other hand, it's coming from people who seem to have hierarchical authority in the Church. And how do you deal with that? So it took us a while to figure out that it's either one way or the other. That if you as a Catholic make a judgment on the nature of these doctrinal and disciplinary changes as being false and as being evil, that's also implicitly a judgment on the authority of those who promulgated these doctrines and disciplines. But the question is, how do you figure it out? And where do you go? How do you reconcile this in terms of Catholic theology? And this was what prompted the pamphlet Traditionalists, Infallibility, and the Pope.
Many Catholics would probably say, oh, well, you can't possibly judge. You know, they would probably say, who am I to judge? But
especially now.
Well, the precedent has been set. Can't get away from that. in all seriousness, given the size and the weight of the problems, this is not a long document. This is a fairly short, in your inimitable style. It's fairly short and to the point. Actually, pretty much half the document is appendices, references, where you prove time and time again that this is well researched and it is a valid position. You rewrote and republished this article when Ratzinger apparently ascended to the papal throne. Why was that? What was your origin of the article originally? Why was it originally created and why was it republished?
Okay, well, first of all, this in fact was a pressing issue, but in the days before the internet, researching a pressing and a complicated issue was actually very difficult. You had to have access to different theological works, and the way that you got access to them was by going to a library. And if you were lucky enough that it was a big library, it had theological works that referred to the issues that you were looking at. So you had between the 60s to the 70s and the 80s a gap in there where people are trying to figure this out and to get the correct sort of information that they need theologically to resolve these particular issues. Now, the question of a heretical pope was one that was in fact raised when I was at a cone by the then Father Gerard de Laurier. He talked about that particular issue, but it was difficult to find out more information on this. You had someone like Father Gerard de Laurier, and on the opposite side, you had people like Michael Davies, who had a different concept of how things were to go. That he promoted the idea that you could recognize someone as a Roman pontiff, but resist him. So Davies decided to write an article trying to refute the ideas of sedevacantism, the ideas that a pope could in fact fall into heresy and then cease to be pope. And so he wrote a booklet called I Am With You Always. And this was published in English, of course, by the Angelus Press, and put forward a number of arguments that tried to refute this concept or this idea that a pope could fall into heresy and lose his office. So this enjoyed a fairly decent circulation in the English-speaking world in the late 1980s. And I was approached in 1990 by a convert to the faith, whose name was Jerry Matitex. And Jerry was a convert from Presbyterianism, and he became a traditionalist, and he was interested in seeing what a refutation would be to the arguments of Michael Davies from the point of view of a sedevacantist. So in 1990, 1991, I started to research this issue in the theological sections of different libraries, and I produced the first draft of this pamphlet. Actually, it was a 4-page version of it that I handed out to some people at a traditionalist conference at which Michael Davies was present. So actually, the essential text predates 1995. It was much earlier in the 90s. So then I decided to publish it as a little pamphlet, and to publish all the appendices with it, the appendices giving citations and quotes from different theologians on the question of the heretical pope, whether or not that was a possibility, and answering some objections. So in 1995, I published this as a pamphlet, and it enjoyed a very wide circulation. I have to say, it's gone everywhere in the world. People have gotten hold of it have written to us and asked for copies of it. And I'm sure it's upward of 25,000 copies that we've spread throughout the world, even before the days of the Internet. In the 1995 version, I talked about some of the errors of John Paul II, who was, of course, regarded, as we know, by many people as the great conservative, or someone who's quite favorable to traditional Catholic doctrine. Of course, that is false, and so I discuss the general principles on the question of a heretical pope in this particular pamphlet, and then adduce some specifics about John Paul II. So I examined the question in terms of JP2 in 1995, and then when Ratzinger came along, of course, in 2006 or 2005, he had the reputation of being a great conservative too, so we had to include some material about Ratzinger in 2006, and then answer some subsequent objections that had been made. So that is the background to the original work, and then the first two editions of Traditionalist Infallibility of the Pope.
Okay. At the start of the article, you point out, and I quote, "Bad Catholics pick and choose what laws they want to obey. Yet at the same time, the very men who would appear to possess authority in the hierarchy command us to accept doctrines and a mass which harm the faith or have other disastrous effects. What is a Catholic to do?" And you go on to say that the Novus Ordo does not believe in objective truth, and you respond to the idea that we are simply objecting to minutiae, that these things are really irrelevant. The Vatican II is not a substantial change, and that really, in reality, we are being... it's a storm in a teacup. What would you like to say about that?
Well, the reason I mention that is that was an objection that one frequently heard. From the beginning, a reproach that people made that of all this, your worries about the liturgy, this is all you're sweating the small stuff, and it's not something that you should really worry about, or that the question of the new teachings on marriage. Well, this is not really anything that's sort of substantial. And ecumenism, this is just basically trying to get along nicely with other people. So the rejection that traditionalists had of these different changes in doctrine and discipline tended to be in the minds of some people as things that are basically small or unimportant matters of detail. And so you have to get people like that to the point where they realize that no, it's not just a matter of detail, but it's something substantial. Now, I think that in our own time, by now in the age of Bergoglio, that people are more willing to admit that there are changes afoot that are, in fact, substantial. But at the beginning, it wasn't that way, so that's why he had to tell them this.
Although some people may admit now that there are changes that are substantial, that are manifesting themselves, they still struggle with the idea of pulling this all back to Vatican II, that actually what Bergoglio is doing now is essentially the full flowering, or perhaps not even, Vatican II. They have problems with that. Why is this?
Well, people don't look and read text closely, and they have when it comes to the documents of Vatican II, it was a revolution that was supposed to be designed to be launched in stages. And the way this was done was through ambiguity, as it were, getting the nose of the camel into the tent. And that's what the ambiguity in the documents of Vatican II and the subsequent teachings of the so-called popes of Vatican II did. That it was a revolution in stages, and now we see the full flowering of that in Bergoglio. If you take just one example, the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy of Vatican II has many edifying things in it. However, there are these time bombs, as actually one of the fathers of Vatican II, Monsignor Jenny, said that were in the different documents that allowed changes in the liturgy that would have been inconceivable and would have horrified the majority of the fathers at Vatican II. So that's how it went. That you start with something small to get the nose of the camel in the tent, and that eventually you get someone like Bergoglio, who's really a revolutionary and a bomb thrower.
Well, that's certainly true.
The site Novus Ordo Watch refers to him as Chaos Frank. And it's absolutely true. It's perfect because the guy is a bomb thrower. There's not a week that goes by where he doesn't do something crazy. For the other show that we do, Francis Watch, how frequently I've said to Stephen Heiner at the beginning of the month, it looks like there's not going to be too much. It's going to be a slow month. I don't know how we're going to get a show together. But then, sure enough, he does something like the hammer and sickle crucifix. That's the latest thing. So it's always something like that as the revolution goes onward.
Before the show, I was watching the Twitter stream, and I was looking at Father Desposito, actually. He said that Francis left all of the gifts in Bolivia, apart from that hammer and sickle crucifix. He actually took that with him.
In fact, he did, and it turns out he said on the plane that he took it with him, and I wonder if it's going to go to to Santa Maria Maggiore and take its place there with the beach ball on the altar from his last South American trip. As they say, you can't make it up. It's like the Sadie Vacanta's satirist who is in the basement of the Vatican, in the room where Paul VI used to be held prisoner, and that this guy is coming up with all of these crazy things for Bergoglio to do.
Well, look, I mean, I don't want to steal the thunder of Francis Watch, so I'm gonna move on there. I'll let you and his lordship and Stephen chew over these in a few weeks' time.
Right.
So, and I'm sure I'll enjoy listening to it just as much as talking about it. So, moving on to the idea that we've already established that you were not objecting to mere minutiae, and that there was obviously a reaction to it. And Vatican II certainly did promote evil and errors. Let's just go for just a very quick tour through some of the evils and errors that you mentioned in your article. And I just asked you to explain each very briefly. Could you just talk about the subsistit error very quickly?
This is the new ecclesiology or theology of the Church, an ecumenical theology. And you have the statement of Vatican II that, the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. So obviously this the phrase was used, subsist, as a replacement for is the Catholic Church, which is the traditional teaching. And so this implies that the true Church can exist or subsist elsewhere in other religious bodies. So that's one of your points. You see this also reflected in the subsequent legislation. You see it reflected in the new catechism. You see it reflected in the 1983 Code of Canon Law. So it starts out here with the nose of the camel, and then you get the rest of the beast in the tent.
The next error that you mentioned is the primary and secondary ends of marriage and how they were reversed. Could you just quickly explain that for listeners?
Sure. The traditional teaching is that the primary purpose of marriage is procreation, and the secondary ends of marriage are unitive. The unitive ends of marriage, the expression of love between the husband and the wife, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of secondary, the ends of marriage, or the remedy for concupiscence, et cetera. What you have in the Vatican II is the documents place the ends of marriage on the same level and then reverse the order. So you get, it talks about unitive and the procreative ends of marriage. So you don't have that distinction. So what happens is people say, aha, there's a tacit support for contraception because, well, what if I have in my wonderful conscience, which is now my supreme guide, what if I have a conflict between my understanding of the mutual affection we should have for each other and procreation? Oh, I'm going to have a crisis in conscience over that. I'm going to choose the love for my husband over procreation. So that's how that works. But it's these small distinctions that get thrown out and that lead to other problems.
The next thing that you mentioned, I'm actually going to read these out because for people who are listening who are thinking about these problems, perhaps people who are still in the Novus Order and wondering what's going on here, I'm just going to mention very briefly the suppression of these concepts from the Paul VI Missal. These were all suppressed. Hell, divine judgment, God's wrath, punishment for sin, the wickedness of sin as the greatest evil, detachment from the world, purgatory, the souls of the departed, Christ's kingship on earth, the church militant, the triumph of the Catholic faith, the evils of heresy, schism, and error, the conversion of non-Catholics, and the merits of the saints and miracles. Now, why were they all suppressed, Father?
Because two reasons. First of all, ecumenism, that some of the idea of the church militant or the triumph of the Catholic faith, evils of heresy, obviously that's against one of the values of Vatican II, which is ecumenism. So those have to go. And the Reformers told us explicitly that things which offended our separated brethren were going to be removed from the liturgy. The other horn of the dilemma, or let's say the devil's pitchfork, is these ideas of hell, judgment, wrath. The modernists do not believe in these ideas, in these concepts, and they correctly perceive that modern man, the secular, godless man, doesn't believe in them either, so they want to suppress these ideas from the liturgy as well. And this is exactly what they did. So you find those suppressions very clearly in the new Mass and the new Missal when you compare that with the old texts. So that goes. All of those things go. And having suppressed them from the law of prayer, the lex orandi, pretty soon they disappear from the lex credendi, from the law of believing as well, which of course is just what happened.
So gone is the idea of teaching and admonishing and warning people. That's passé now.
Yeah, except if you're talking about saving water or something, and that you're free to do in recycling. One correspondent wrote to me and said the latest Bergoglio encyclical about that probably Father Feeney would have fainted because Francis no doubt will go on to encourage the baptism of desire as a replacement for baptism of water to save water. So. Which seems like very tight theological reasoning to me.
Well, it's consistent, if nothing else.
It certainly is.
So let's move on to the next era, communion in the hand. Why was that introduced?
The idea, they told us that it was restoring a primitive Christian practice, which is basically a lot of nonsense. They don't have... These things are not all that certain as regards to documentation, but in any event, the real idea is to suppress the notion of transubstantiation in the real presence. That the people who were in favor of this did not believe in transubstantiation. I knew this for a fact. I lived through this particular period. They believed in transsignification, where the meaning of the bread changed, or transfinalization, where the purpose of the bread changed, but not in transubstantiation. So the idea is that we change a liturgical practice to change people's faith. And those who were the advocates of communion in the hand initially were the Protestant heretics who didn't believe in the sacred nature of the priesthood or in the real presence of Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. So that had to go.
How did they do it? Because as a traditional Catholic, I would be horrified if somebody told me to receive communion in the hand. I would refuse.
People just you had priests in different countries who simply started to do it, and this has started to happen, I think, as early as 1965. You know, when before even Vatican II had completely wound up, priests were doing this, and they were saying there's a new theology, a new understanding of the Eucharist, that the primary presence now of Christ is in the people of God. We shouldn't be worried about such things. So when you have these ideas in the air, you indoctrinate people with these ideas. So it was not officially approved by Paul VI, but eventually he approved it as the bishops' conferences approved it, and then now it has become a universal practice. So it is it was something that started out as implementation of these crazy theological ideas, and then eventually won official approval.
And I suppose this all ties in with the last area that you mentioned, which is the teaching of what the Mass is, i.e. an assembly supper concelebrated by all present, not just the priest, in which Christ is present in the people.
Yes, that's the common idea that was taught. That before we had this bad idea of the primary presence of Christ being in the Eucharist and of being some sort of sacrifice to make propitiation for sins, but now theology has evolved beyond that, and we're now adult about it, and we don't really. While that belief was good, maybe in the 15 and 1600s, it's not good anymore. It doesn't speak to what modern man wants, so we have to change it. But that's exactly the rationale it was followed.
Thankfully, I never had to read much of Ratzinger's prose, but for those who did, yourself included, you do bring out some of the problems here, and I'd like to go through them. So this is what Ratzinger had to say about the new ecclesiology. Schismatic bodies, those are sects that are separated from the church, are particular churches united to the Catholic Church by close bonds. How could this be accepted by traditional Catholics?
Well, it can't, because you're either part of the church or you're not part of the church. And what you have in someone like Ratzinger is he rejected standard Thomism, and in fact he hated it, and basically rejected sort of the principle of identity and objective truth. So for someone like him, you can a being can be and not be in the same time, in the same respect. So you can be somehow part of the church, but not part of the church. And so he developed this theory of the church that I actually call Frankenchurch, that you have these different elements of the church, and that you have sort of a super church beyond it that is the people of God. So you have the people of God, and that the Roman Catholic Church is sort of part of the people of God. And you become part of the people of God by baptism, and the whole people of God participate somehow in the office of Christ. So this is a new Vatican II teaching, and we started to hear this people of God nonsense right away from the modernists in the 1960s. And so Ratzinger developed this ecclesiology meaning theology of the church, to include all sorts of different people who are not really considered to be part of the Catholic Church because they're outside of the body of the church.
And I suppose this all ties in with the second point that you make, which is Ratzinger's assertion that the universal church is the body of particular churches.
Yes, that's particular churches is one of the weasel words that they use, and that particular churches include the schismatic Greek Orthodox, for instance, and of schismatic churches, he says that, well, they have a wounded existence, but nevertheless, the universal church becomes present in the particular church in all her essential elements. So what he's saying is well, yes and no at the same time. That they're somehow wounded, but nevertheless, the universal church is present in them. So it's all of these insane contradictory propositions. And people go for it because he wears silk and rabbits for outfits, but in fact he's a heretic who just dresses well, and so this is the point I think that people miss, that he's created this completely different ecclesiology, this ecumenical ecclesiology.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to do a few more of these heresies because you bring them out in your article. So we need to go through them. One becomes a member of the people of God by baptism, and this whole people of God participate in the office of Christ. Yes,
that's the teaching of the New Catechism, and it's also the teaching of Vatican II. That the baptism makes you a part of the people of God. So what you have here is you have, in effect, a super church consisting of this people of God that has different parts of itself, different parts have different belief systems, in effect. But that's all good because they're all part of the people of God. And of course, the notion of it is this idea is this contradicts Catholic teaching, because when you talk about the unity of the Church, credo in unum ecclesiam, it's one in doctrine, in worship, and in government as well, and that those who are separated from her and are not part of the Catholic Church. So what they did is they created a larger people of God category at Vatican II, and Ratzinger developed this Frankenchurch theology in order to include all of these other bodies somehow.
And this is all for the purpose of ecumenism.
Well, sure, and it's all in the service of ecumenism. And then what you see is Ratzinger would do this in a somewhat deceptive way and confusing way, because he was a very intelligent man. Ratzinger, there's no question, is a great, great intelligent man, also very evil because of his modernist ideas. So he says, he throws these propositions around in such a way to in effect confuse people and who are distracted by the rabbit fur. But then Bergoglio comes along, and since he's not an intelligent man and he doesn't wear rabbit fur and silk, in fact he's an idiot who just sort of says the first thing that comes into his head. He quite openly teaches what these different doctrines mean, where he talks about, for instance, the Anglican Pentecostal as his brother bishop, and he talks about having, essential, that in the essentials of faith that we are the same with these different evangelicals. So he comes across quite differently, but he simply the propositions that Ratzinger lays down to their logical conclusion.
Yeah, I must say, as an English person, I couldn't have been more offended by watching him receive a blessing from the so-called Archbishop of Canterbury.
Oh.
It couldn't be more offensive than that for somebody who purports to be the Roman Pontiff to drop so low as to receive a blessing from somebody who Leo XIII has already declared doesn't even have any orders.
Yes, yeah, and for whose faith people were martyred, It's absolutely outrageous. So that affects you that way, and then for an American, when you see these American Pentecostals that he dealt with, Kenneth Copeland, and took him seriously, those people are clowns. And it's this materialistic success gospel. But yet Bergoglio is doing high fives and knuckle raps with these people. So it's really outrageous. But it's the basis for his knuckle raps and high fives. And the basis for Bergoglio talking about these Protestant sects the way that he does is the theology of Ratzinger.
Yes, that's open. That's why we're talking about it. On one hand, Bergoglio can go and talk Marxism to the South Americans. On the other hand, he's talking the success gospel to the North Americans.
Sure.
Yeah, it's all the same because it's all ecumenism, and this didn't come from Ratzinger. But this is what Ratzinger taught, and I'm sure Bergoglio believes it just as strongly, if not more so.
Sure. Whatever you seem to believe is basically fine, as long as it's not the traditional Catholic faith that you treat as exclusive.
A really horrible error. Ratzinger says Christ's body, the church, is wounded. Where does this come from? Or is that too much of a question?
Yeah, well, the thing is that it comes from his heresy, because he considers these other people to be part of the church. In a real sense, those who participate and believe in these different heresies, he considers to be part of the church, and so somehow there's a wound where there's not this unity on absolutely everything. But ultimately, it doesn't make any difference, because it's these outfits are used as means of salvation by the Holy Ghost anyway, which is also part of his teaching and the teaching of the New Catechism. So it doesn't make any difference that they may be wounded or they may have a little head cold, but nevertheless they're going to survive as members of the church.
That's a very good point. That last point about the fact that these schismatic and heretical bodies are means of salvation, because at a stroke it ridicules all of the martyrs that suffered under Protestantism.
Sure, absolutely, because they suffered for nothing. That is the logical conclusion. Or Paul VI, I think, said that the English martyrs were martyrs for religious liberty, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Which no doubt would have come as a surprise to all of them, that this is what they were dying for. I can imagine the wit of Thomas More, what he would have done with something as idiotic as that. But there it is.
Oh, Cardinal St. John Fisher, yeah, of course. I'm sure he would have had something to say about it.
Oh, yeah.
And finally, and I see this a lot now, and it's crept into SSPX circles as well. They're not in terms of particular churches, but in terms of being fully Catholic or partially Catholic. You know, we have full communion or partial communion. What is this all about? Because as a Catholic, my understanding is that you're either in communion with the Catholic Church or you're not.
Yeah, it's like being partially dead or partially pregnant. That there's a state that is impossible, because the Catholic doctrine is an integral whole, and you can't say that. Well, you can't say that it admits of parts. That being Catholic, being a member of the Church of Christ, somehow admits of degrees or of parts, because it's integral. It's either yes or no. And that indeed is the point of the profession of faith and of being a Catholic, that you are one with the Church. So the idea of degrees of belonging simply doesn't exist.
And as you point out in your article, Leo XIII said simply, heretics are outside of the Catholic communion and alien to the Church. That's the end. That's the end of the conversation.
Yes, that's right.
Moving on to the next part of the article, we then move on to error and evil. You talk about the fact the Church cannot give evil, but first of all, you discuss the difference between error and evil. Could you please explain that for the listeners?
Sure. An error is a contradiction or a change in the substance of teachings. Okay, so that if you're talking about error, you're talking the level of, let's say, faith. We could say that. And the other thing is evil, and that is, if you want to make a parallel, morals. In other words, something in conduct that's offensive to God or that harms the salvation of souls. So we all know that we learn from the Catechism, okay, infallibility and faith and morals. So this is the idea. An error is against faith, and that an evil, by that we're talking about something that has to do with morality or conduct. Okay. So that's our distinction there.
The next problem, one that I hear, I'm sure you hear it a lot too, the one that I hear a lot, is we only need to think about ex cathedra statements. We don't. There's no infallibility beyond that, and they haven't said anything ex cathedra yet. So we're just going to carry on doing what we're doing. What's the problem with that?
That's the most common reply that you would hear from the recognize and resist camp, the R&R people, and you would. That is something that's very old in the traditionalist movement. That the idea that infallibility is something that's very, very restricted, and you only have to pay attention to the Pope if he puts ex cathedra stamp on something, and he hasn't done that so far. So therefore, we're not obliged to. We're not obliged to accept it. So that's a very old trend in the trad movement, and I remember basically hearing that from Archbishop Lefebvre. And what struck me at the time, and that was in the seminary at Cone, was I thought, well, there may be something to that, because if Lefebvre, who is the right wing, as it were, says this, I also heard this in my modernist seminary too, and we were studying ecclesiology using the text of Hans King. So Hans King said the same thing too. So I figured if Lefebvre and King agreed on something, well, it must be fairly certain. But however, it's completely false, and Lefebvre was completely wrong. And this is something that we learn later, that the Church is, or her teaching is infallible when it's part not only of the solemn magisterium, ex cathedra statements and conciliar canons, but also universal ordinary magisterium. So when it comes to the teaching of a particular doctrine, if the Pope and the bishops all teach it, then it is supposed to be, it is part of the universal ordinary magisterium of the Church, and Vatican I teaches that as well is infallible. So that's as far as teaching. The other thing is that when it comes to conduct or morals, again, we could say that the Church is also infallible when she promulgates what is called a universal disciplinary law for the whole Church. The reason she is infallible, theologians tell you, is that Christ's authority cannot prescribe something that is evil or that is harmful, directly harmful to souls, that harms faith or morals. So the difficulty that you have is the changes in doctrine appear to come from people who possess the authority of the Church, A, and B, the laws prescribing the new Mass, the new Code of Canon Law, etc., are also universal disciplinary laws, which would be covered by the Church's infallibility. But all trads believe that these things are evil. So how do you reconcile that the idea of what is of errors in effect in universal ordinary magisterium and evil prescriptions in, say, liturgical laws and disciplinary laws, with the idea of the infallibility and the indefectibility of the church. So that's where we come up against the problem.
Another argument that I use with people who say that is, well, actually, there were no ex-cathedra statements until 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea. So all the early martyrs, should they have sat there in their dungeons getting ready to be fed to the lions, thinking, well, I don't know, there aren't any solemn papal pronouncements that says we have to believe all of these things. So those lions, they look pretty fierce, and, you know, we don't have to. So doesn't it throw that into doubt?
Well, of course it does, because there's nothing. You end up with nothing in effect that you're bound to believe in, or you get to pick what you think you should believe in, and that, of course, is wrong, because the reason that you have the teaching church is that the church tells you what to believe and provides a sure guide for belief and for your conduct as well.
I think to sum up the first part of this show, it's just worth saying that we've established that it's impossible that the errors and the evils that we're discussing could have proceeded from what is in fact the authority of the church. It's impossible. It's not doubtful. It's not questionable. It's not inconclusive. It's not debatable. It's impossible. And what would be the point of the church if it could err in this manner?
That's exactly it. The church would end up failing in her mission. So one would have to come to and figure out some sort of an explanation for this that is consonant with Catholic doctrine. Once you make the judgment that there are errors and there are evils that have officially came from people who supposedly have authority in the church, then you have to figure out the authority problem.
We would like to remind you that you are listening to the anti-modernist reader, Traditionalists, Infalibility, and the Pope on the Restoration Radio Network. I am your host, Matthew Gaskin, and I'm joined by Father Anthony Cekada, and today we've been discussing the problem of how to reconcile an apparently defective hierarchy with indefectibility. We want to remind you that this anti-modernist reader show is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. To obtain permission, please write to mail@truerestoration.org. Okay, Father, so moving on to the next part of the article, you begin to talk about the loss of office through heresy. You talk about the decrees of heretical or schismatic bishops becoming void and empty of authority for Catholics. Could you give some examples, historical examples, of when this sort of thing happened?
For instance, we're going to take an example from England, okay, that with the arrival of Protestant heirs in England, you had clerics who were in different positions of authority there who had been, let us say, legitimately appointed, who adopted these new errors and these false teachings. So you had, for instance, Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He had been validly consecrated and so on. And but at a certain point, he became in effect, a Lutheran in his teaching, and he started to publicly promote these false ideas, these false teachings. He continued to claim to be the legitimate Archbishop of Canterbury, and he, being an Englishman and having, of course, as all Englishmen do, excellent taste, he walked around in a very nice coat and spoke a beautiful form of the English language and held himself out as the Archbishop of Canterbury. But from the point at which he became a heretic, he lost his authority over Catholics, because public heresy puts you outside the church. So Catholics were not obliged to treat him as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and certainly not obliged to submit themselves to his decrees. So that's a historical example that's rather near home, I would say.
I'll quote a short piece of the article here. That principle being that public defection from the Catholic faith automatically deprives a person of all ecclesiastical offices he may hold. You say, if you think about it, it makes sense. It would be absurd for someone who did not truly profess the Catholic faith to have authority over Catholics who did. The principle that someone who defects from the faith automatically loses his office applies to pastors, diocesan bishops, and other similar church officials. It also applies to a pope. Now, this is where the sticking point is, because people are perfectly happy to accept that any Catholic, from layman through a seminarian, a priest, a bishop, even a cardinal, people are perfectly happy, I think, to accept that anybody in whatever position, if they become a public heretic, that they're automatically they excommunicate themselves. But the real sticking point is the Pope. People really struggle with this one, and this is where people dig their heels in and they don't want to move. Why is this such a problem for people? Why? Well, we'll go on to look at some of the writers, very notable writers who have said that this is perfectly possible. Why do people not want to admit this?
Well, because as Catholics, at least particularly from my own generation, that you were brought up with the correct idea that as a good Catholic you had to submit to the Roman Pontiff, and that the Roman Pontiff could not steer you wrong when it came to faith and when it came to morals. So you have this natural inclination, a good inclination as a Catholic in normal times in the Church, that you have to submit to the Roman Pontiff. So the idea that possibly he could steer you wrong or fall into heresy or anything like that, and lose his office is something that is that emotionally is very difficult to take. And I certainly understand that, because I was someone who defended Paul VI for 10 years, even though I was skeptical about some of the things that were coming out of with his official approval from the Vatican. So you have there's this weight. The default setting is that, well, after all, the guy is the Pope, and that we're supposed to submit to him, etc. And so the thought that he could lose his office somehow through heresy is emotionally is a big jump.
Mm-hmm. On the flip side of that coin, I know a few Catholics, they're still within the SSPX, they're still within the Recognize and Resist Brigade. And these are older people. These are people who were around a long time before the changes came in and remember Catholicism as it used to be. And they said that actually the Pope has no direct bearing on their life. That one of the people said that the Pope has no direct effect on his life day to day. How can this be, or is this the effect of the R&R position?
Well, yes. The idea is that you have minimized the importance of submission to the Roman Pontiff and to his teaching, and in fact, it is it's standard pre-Vatican II teaching that, apart from infallible pronouncements and even apart from the teaching of the Pope and bishops that would be considered universal ordinary magisterium, that you have an obligation as a Catholic to adhere to the day-to-day teaching, as it were, of the Roman Pontiff, because he has a special authority apart from the infallible authority that comes from Christ. So there's a difficulty, and a great difficulty, a theological difficulty, in them saying that. Even if you take if you take, say, an encyclical, that you have an obligation of religious submission, even if there are matters in encyclical that are not the Pope is not infallibly defined, as a Catholic, is very clear. You have to religiously submit to the teachings of the Roman Pontiff. So the thing is that the R&R camp has, in effect, been promoting something that is contrary to what a Catholic is obliged to do. I mean, you would, if you apply the old principles, when Bergoglio says, you have to recycle and save water, you have to have religious submission to, that particular teaching. It's the R&R, the recognize and resist, could also stand for R&R, recognize and recycle. That would have to be part of it. So it's a different concept then that these people have of their obligation toward the teaching of the Roman Pontiff.
So essentially, this so-called third way of recognizing and resisting, neither Novus Ordo nor Sedevacantists, has created in the mind of this person I know, or has turned the mind of this person I know from being completely Catholic to, after years and years of recognizing and resisting, being totally indifferent. I do know that one of the recognize and resist crowd within the so-called resistance says that, well, you hear a lot of it. It's really just an opinion. You don't have to worry about papal infallibility, and it doesn't really matter. Yet at the same time, he says, well, I don't like the term recognize and resistor. He doesn't like it. So would it be more, I mean, this is just my opinion, but would it be fairer to call him an indifferent? He's indifferent about papal authority. He doesn't really care.
Well, it may be in that particular case, but one of the things I found is that the people who are in the Pius X camp will say that, yes, it is a question of recognize and resist. That, we recognize him as Pope, but we resist him when he says things that are not Catholic. So your friend, I think, would be sort of exceptional, but I think most would concede that that's an accurate, that the R&R label is actually an accurate description of the position. And it was not intended to be, an inaccurate or a dig. It's what, in fact, they do if you analyze it.
I completely agree. You go on in the article and you talk about the loss of papal office, and you discuss the various theologians and canonists who have talked about this. And one of the people you start off with is St. Robert Bellarmine. Mm-hmm. And the quotation given from De Romano Pontifice, I will read it out here. It's, a pope who is a manifest heretic automatically, that is per se, ceases to be pope and head, just as he ceases automatically to be a Christian and a member of the church. Wherefore he can be judged and punished by the church. This is the teaching of all the ancient fathers, who teach that manifest heretics immediately lose all jurisdiction. Why is that so important? Why did you start off with that quotation in particular? Why is it so important?
Well, 2 points. First of all, it's St. Robert Bellarmine, and his teaching on this particular point influenced virtually all of the theologians who came after him, who wrote about the question of a heretical pope. So he was, I suppose we would call him a big gun. Okay, he was he's like the equivalent. I don't know if you know the old movie, The Guns of the Guns of Navarone, but I mean yes. he's that type of a voice in theology. So and he didn't just sort of toss this opinion out in sort of a tweet or something like that. But he actually wrote this is part of his great treatise, De Romano Pontifice, which is a defense of the Catholic teaching on the authority of both the legal and the teaching authority of the Roman Pontiff. So this is very, very carefully thought out. And what we gave you here is just a little thing from chapter 30. So it's important because it's Bellarmine. Secondly, it's important because if you step back from it, it simply puts in to practice a general theological principle which no one disputes, and that is, to be a part of the church, you have to A, be baptized, and B, profess the Catholic faith. If you cease to profess the Catholic faith, the second point, that if you do that publicly, you put yourself outside the church. Bellarmine, what he is doing is simply applying a general principle across the board. And he cites previous authorities who maintain this. And then you see theologians after Bellarmine adopting exactly this position.
Because some theologians, well, actually, you refer to it later, some theologians don't even consider the fact that it was possible, but this, as you point out, this view is later abandoned. Anybody who's read the life of St. Robert Bellarmine will know that he was not, well, he was a fairly busy man. He had a lot to do. Why would he spend time, valuable time, on things that were not even theoretically possible?
Well, exactly. And because, well, he, in his De Romano Pontifice, he wanted to give the arguments and consider everything from all the angles, because he expected that his opponents, the Protestants, would do exactly that. And anticipating, for instance, the idea that, well, what if a pope as an individual falls into heresy? So he answers it. And he gives the Catholic teaching based on the authorities he's consulted to respond to that question. So it's not angels dancing, as it were, on the head of a pin. It was an objection that he anticipated would arise.
You go on to also cite the likes of Cajetan, Suarez, Torquemada, not names that perhaps the average layperson is familiar with. You also quote Vance Vidal. All the quotations are included in the appendix to the article, but the Vance Vidal quotation is worth reading. He says, through notorious and openly divulged heresy, the Roman pontiff, should he fall into heresy, by that very fact, that is ipso facto, is deemed to be deprived of the power of jurisdiction, even before any declaratory judgment by the Church. A pope who falls into public heresy would cease ipso facto to be a member of the Church, therefore he would also cease to be head of the Church. Now, this is significant because a lot of people, you hear it all the time, you can't judge, you don't know, you can't make that judgment. And what I always say is, I'm not judging his guilt. I don't know if Bergoglio is doing, or Ratzinger, or Voitura, or Montini were doing what they were doing out of malice. I have no idea if they're guilty or not. But I do know that they're not. I do know they're not Catholics. That much is obvious. And I'd have to be willfully blind to assert that they are Catholics.
Yes, it's a question of separating heresy from the truth. What is the Catholic faith, and what is not? What is incompatible with the Catholic faith? And surely, it is absolutely certain that the individual Catholic has the right to do that, and that is all, in fact, that we are doing. The one little point, by the way, that we would make here is that that you occasionally will hear people say that, well, okay, Vance Vidal is talking about a declaratory judgment. How does that, from the Church, how would this play into it? Well, the people like Vance Vidal who talk about something like this have in mind a situation where you had a pope who himself becomes a heretic, and this becomes publicly manifest, but those around him immediately recognize it, the College of Cardinals, etc., and the whole Church recognizes it. Okay, he's fallen from office. What we have to do is we have to go and we have to elect a new pope. So in order to do that, we have to make a declaration that the new guy that we're going to elect is really the pope, not the old guy. So that's all that this refers to. That theologians like Verenz Vidal say that you have the heretical pope, manifestly heretical, falls from office automatically, and then subsequent to that, we have to elect a new pope. So we have to. Canon law requires us to declare that the new guy is going to be the pope. So that's all that means. It's simply a provision of canon law, Canon 151.
Thank you for clarifying that. You go on next to talk about even the post-Vatican II canonists concede that the Pope would lose office if he became a manifest heretic.
Yeah, that was there's a commentary in the 1983 code that speaks just about that mentions the opinion of classical canonists on this particular issue. So it's one that was not even that's not even dismissed by the post-Vatican II guys. So that they recognize that this theological opinion is widely accepted.
So even if you're of the Vatican II opinion, you still can't get away from the idea that the Roman Pontiff cannot lose his office through heresy.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about Popes Innocent III and Paul IV and some of the weighty contributions they've made to this subject. Pope Innocent III, first of all, says, "Still less can the Roman Pontiff boast, for he can be judged by men, or rather, he can be shown to be judged, if he manifestly loses his Saviour in heresy, for he who does not believe is already judged." Again, this is a significant problem for the recognize and resist crowd.
Mm-hmm. Well, and precisely, if you have a little historical understanding of who Innocent III was, I mean, he was considered the apex of examples of medieval pontiffs who consolidated, protected, and enunciated the concepts of the authority of the Roman pontiffs. So, I mean, this guy is he was not exactly some sort of a weakling and shrinking violet who had a adversely affected self-image where he thought really very little of himself in his office, etc., and that life was simply a question of I'm okay and you're okay and that's fine. No, I mean he was someone who really asserted the authority of the Roman Pontiff, as did Bellarmine, of course. So for him to say something like this is extremely significant. That to say that the Roman Pontiff loses his savor by falling into heresy, he is already judged by God. So this is something that, you can't say that, okay, this idea of a pope falling into heresy, it's maybe some idea that Bellarmine came up with, and this crazy crackpot out of Ohio, Cekada, promoted throughout the world. But it's Innocent III, for heaven's sake. So something like this is extremely significant because he admits the possibility, right? He admits the possibility. So it's not that crazy. In fact, it's not crazy at all. Because it conforms with this basic principle that profession of faith, is part of your membership in the church. If you publicly cease to profess the faith through falling into heresy, you put yourself outside the church. Again, it's that same principle.
Well, I think listeners to this show will probably concede that it's not crazy. If you want crazy, you need to go and watch what Mr. B is doing. But it's not crazy at all compared to that. Nothing is. The next point that I would like to come on to is cum ex apostolatus, because it's thrown around a lot, and I get a lot of questions about it. One of the questions, first of all, what is cum ex apostolatus? What was the document, who wrote it, and what did it do?
Okay, what we're talking about there is that Pope Paul IV, in 1559, promulgated this document, cum ex apostolatus officio. And the situation was this, that when the midst of all these religious controversies in Europe, heresy, etc., there was a cardinal in the college, Giovanni Morone, who Paul IV thought was suspect, was a crypto-Lutheran, perhaps. So he had him thrown in the clink, and in the Castle San Angelo, I think, and he promulgated this document, Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio, that said that if it should ever appear that someone who has been elected a Roman pontiff had deviated from the Catholic faith or fallen into heresy, his election, even with the agreement and unanimous consent of all the cardinals, would be null, legally invalid, and void. Okay, so and then he went on to say that his acts would be void, etc. He would not be a true pope, etc., etc., etc. And he promulgated this document and had it signed by all of the cardinals in the college. So this, of course, raised the possibility, again, confirms the possibility that you can have a heretic who ends up on the throne of Peter. So it's not, again, just that crazy guy in Ohio. It's Paul IV, for heaven's sake. So this at the very least demonstrates the possibility that a heretic could be elected.
Okay, so the next question is, and this is a question that I've received from, again, people in the R&R crowd, or a rebuff that has come from the R&R crowd. Mm-hmm. They've said Cum Ex Apostolatus is superseded by the 1917 Code of Canon Law, so we can disregard it.
All right. Well, first of all, you say this, that you can't disregard it because it shows, A, it is theologically possible, and a pope taught that a heretic could end up on the throne of Peter. So that's the first response. The second response is that, in fact, in Canon 188.4, in the footnotes in the Code of Canon Law, you will see that the provision in the Code of Canon Law, in the new Code of Canon Law, Canon 188.4, refers specifically to Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio. And 188.4 says that public defection from the Catholic faith brings with it tacit renunciation of ecclesiastical office. So to the extent that that provision is included in the code, yes, that part of Cum Ex Apostolatus is included in the new Code of Canon Law. Thirdly, one can discuss certainly the different details of Cum Ex Apostolatus, in which it's a long document full of different legal language that talk about degradation from office and removal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the underlying principle is actually a principle of divine law, and that is that a heretic cannot possess papal authority, and that is, in fact, a matter of divine law. So the thing is that explicitly, sure, it's not something that is part of the new Code of Canon Law, but nevertheless, there are elements of it that are incorporated into the new code. But you can't poo-poo Cum Ex Apostolatus because of the essential principle that it enunciates. So does that sufficiently, you think, answer your question?
Well, as soon as you mention it as part of divine law, then there's no further conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, what it did is it put into effect. See, what you have in the code is you have elements of ecclesiastical law that things which are ecclesiastical law that show you how to implement divine law. So, for instance, you have the commandment about the Lord's Day, keeping the Lord's Day holy. Well, the church, so that's the divine law. Well, the church comes along and says, okay, we're going to add to this. We're going to tell you that we're putting this into effect by saying that you have to assist at Mass on Sundays and the holy days appointed. Okay, so there are those two elements in it. So that's many points in the code are like that.
I would say no more questions, Your Honor, but I have to ask one more, seeing as I have been as I have been asked it. The other objection that was made was cum ex apostolatus is simply a matter of discipline. It's not a matter of doctrine. So I guess this person was saying so. It's a matter of discipline in as much as, you know, not eating meat on Friday, that sort of thing. These doing penance during Lent. This is simply a matter of discipline, and the election of. Can you possibly argue that the election of a Roman pontiff is simply a matter of discipline and doesn't affect doctrine?
Well, it's sort of an odd question and a little difficult to reply to odd questions when you're not sure exactly what the questioner is getting at. But no, it has. Cum ex apostolatus has disciplinary elements in it. You know, there are all these clauses and subclauses and qualifications, etc. So yes, that is a question of discipline. But the ultimately, the principle that it expresses is, in fact, a matter of divine law, and that a heretic cannot validly become a pope, and that is the source of the legislation in Cum ex apostolatus, because faith is being part of is necessary to be a part of membership of the church. A, and then B, the theologians who have written on the qualifications for becoming a Roman pontiff are very clear in saying that public heresy is by divine law something that excludes you from validly being elected pope. Mm-hmm. So to that extent, to the extent it reflects that, it is divine law.
That was the general thrust of the question. The rebuff was essentially, well, it only concerns discipline, and even if it didn't, it's been superseded by the 1917 code, so we don't need to think about it anyway. Which you've demonstrated it hasn't been.
Yeah,
anyway.
But in any event, the important thing to focus on with Cum ex apostolatus is that A, it reflects the divine law as enunciated by other theologians, and B, it certainly anticipates the possibility that you can in fact get a heretic on the throne. So it's not that far-fetched. Paul IV said it.
Okay.
Not the crazy guy in Westchester.
Oh, no, that crazy guy.
No, not that crazy.
Okay. We're getting towards the end of the article now, and you simply put it to Catholics that they're presented with two alternatives. Either the church has defected or men have defected. Now, given that we have to, by faith, exclude the idea that the church has defected, there's only really one choice here. Could you explain that briefly?
Sure. The way that you come to a correct conclusion is by excluding things that are false. And the faith tells us that the idea that the church is defected is false. So that points us in the other direction, that, okay, men have somehow defected, that these men don't have have their authority. Okay, so it's like something that you would find in, let's say, American advertising. You would find a big glitzy neon billboard, that's shaped like a hand pointing you in this particular direction. And
I've seen them.
and it's moving, and it's all very nicely done, etc. To market things and to make all sorts of money, which we're very good at, and so it's pointing you in the direction that that these people cannot possibly possess the authority that Christ gave to His church. So the one thing is the excluding the idea of a church defecting. All of these awful things, these errors, these evils, are pointing you in the same direction that these people are not Catholic, didn't have authority to promulgate these things, and that indeed that's what you end up with, and the theological explanation for that, while theologically you can explain the church defecting and giving you evil and giving you error, you can't explain that from the point of view of Catholic theology. You can't explain the defection from the faith. And we've gotten that from Robert Bellarmine. We've gotten that from all these subsequent theologians. We've gotten that from Innocent III. We've got that from Paul IV, telling us that it's possible for the heretic to it's possible to have a heretical pope. If this guy is publicly heretical, he's not a true pope, and so that's the end of the story as far as the question of authority.
Mm-hmm. You say in the article, our recognition that the changes are false, bad, and to be rejected is also an implicit recognition that the men who promulgated them did not really possess the authority of the Church. All traditionalists, one might therefore say, are in reality sedevacantists. It's just that not all of them have realized it yet.
That's right. And Christopher Ferreira, who is one of the remnant lawyer types who writes anti-sedevacantist articles, I ran into him at a talk he gave over at a local Pius X church in this area. So I went over and I told him afterwards that this just as Karl Rahner had the theory of the anonymous Christian who achieved salvation, that I had the theory of the anonymous sedevacantist who would achieve salvation, and perhaps he could hope to count himself, one day among their number. But needless to say, I didn't convert him with the allusion to Karl Rahner, but what are you going to do?
So you walked into St. Pius X church. They must have turned around and thought the Antichrist had walked in.
Well, yeah, it was, the people holding crucifixes up at you and making the evil eye sign, Well, actually, I'm kidding about that because the church that we have, St. Gertrude's, was the first traditionalist church in the Cincinnati area. So I know a great number of the families over there, and so I went over for it. And most of them were in fact very nice, and it was always nice to see them and kid with them about different things, and so it was a very interesting experience.
I'm sure. I don't doubt it. Right, we'll move on to the summary of the article here. It's worth just going through these very, very briefly and quickly. The first summary point is that officially sanctioned Vatican II and post-Vatican II teachings and laws embody errors and or promote evil. I mean, that's not even up for debate. We've demonstrated that perfectly well.
Yeah, you become a trad because of that. Yeah.
And next, because the Church is indefectible, her teaching cannot change, and because she is infallible, her laws cannot give evil. The third, it is therefore impossible that the errors and evils officially sanctioned in Vatican II and post-Vatican II teachings and laws could have proceeded from the authority of the Church. Those who promulgate such errors and evils must somehow lack real authority in the Church. Canonists and theologians teach that defection from the faith, once it becomes manifest, brings with it automatic loss of ecclesiastical office or authority. They apply the principle even to a pope, who in his personal capacity somehow becomes a heretic. Even popes have acknowledged the possibility that a heretic could one day end up on the throne of Peter. Paul IV decreed that the election of such a pope would be invalid and that he would lack all authority. And since the Church absolutely cannot defect, but a pope as an individual can defect, the best explanation for the post-Vatican II errors and evils we have catalogued is that they proceeded or proceed from the individuals who, despite their occupation of the Vatican and of various diocesan cathedrals, did or do not objectively possess canonical authority. You leave it pretty cut and dried there, Father.
Well, that was the idea, because it is the reasoning is it seems to be pretty clear. I mean, the different propositions that we've talked about and that we've proven here, doesn't require. Once you start with the idea of the evils and the errors of Vatican II, it should lead you straight to that conclusion. Because of the question of the infallibility and defectibility of the Church. So this article has been around for 20 years or more, and as I say, it's gone all over the world. And no one really from the R&R camp has ever been able to poke holes in the reasoning that you find in that summary. You have people who posit different objections to sedevacantism, but as far as dealing with this fairly direct and cut and dried argument, no one really has successfully done it, or I don't think even attempted it. There was one author who wrote in the Angelus who tried to Laszlo Sciarto, who tried to address some of the points in here, but it really did not succeed in answering the points in this argument. So I think that that's a fairly good indication that after 20 years, that the points in it kind of stand the test of time.
Well, I must say, coming from the SSPX, this is one of those articles that as soon as I found it on the internet, it's one of those things that you can't unread. once you've read it, it's there. You can't ignore it, and it certainly contributed in no small measure to me deciding to leave the SSPX. I recommend other people who may be in a similar position to go and have a look at it. Now, let's have a look at the appendices briefly, because it is a well-referenced article. Appendix 1 is simply discusses or cites all of the saints and canonists, theologians. It's good support for rad trads, those people, those sedevacantists. It's good. It's a good reference point for them to say, well, hang on a minute, no, I'm not saying anything wild here. This is what these people have said, and their words are weightier than my own.
Well, one point that I would also make is you hear people in the R&R camp say, well, you've cherry-picked quotes here. That's generally the verb. And yeah. I think my response to that is, well, why don't you go back into the orchard and see if you can find any other cherries, And my recommendation is don't take a big basket because you're not going to find very much.
Okay, I've never heard of that. I'll use that one in the future. The second appendix is interesting, and having recently watched your new video, Stuck in a Rut, it fills in because you discuss heresy, the sin versus the crime, and in a roundabout way, you discussed what you call the orthodoxy buddy in your new video. That people need to have some kind of warning to commit a sin. If they don't have this warning, then there's no sin committed. Could you briefly discuss that and explain it?
Yes, that's the orthodoxy buddy is one of the great myths of those who have written against sedevacantism, that that you get a cleric who just sort of runs at the mouth, making all sorts of different heretical statements publicly, and he doesn't. He can deny the virgin birth. He can deny the incarnation. He can deny transubstantiation. And unless he has someone who tells him that, well, oops, what you said is against the Council of Trent or against the Council of Nicaea, he doesn't become a heretic. He gets 2 or 3 warnings from his orthodoxy buddy, and only at that point does he become a heretic. But this is one of those urban myths, as it were, in the traditionalist world. The equivalent in the secular world would be, I think, the alligators in the sewers of New York. It's something that it's a beast that really doesn't exist, and certainly is not recognized in canon law. There's a distinction between the sin of heresy, which is the moral flaw, just as you could have, say, publicly a sin of someone publicly commits a sin of a murder through, let's say, abortion, and then there is the crime of the crime that a person commits. Abortion is also punishable by different censures in church law as well. So there's a distinction between a sin and a distinction between the crime, and that's what is at work here. That the sin of heresy is what knocks the heretical pope out of office, or the sin of heresy prevents a public heretic from becoming a pope. So you don't have to have an orthodoxy buddy. You don't have to have a trial.
Right. Okay. Thanks for clearing that one up. The third appendix is simply explaining or asking the question, did the new mass come from the church? And you quote the Council of Trent and then many theologians, including Hermann Dorsch, Schultz, Suppisaretto, Iragiri. But the Council of Trent says, if anyone says that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs which the Catholic Church uses in the celebration of masses are incentives to impiety rather than the service of piety, let him be anathema. You then make the point that incentives to impiety, most traditional Catholics of whatever stripe would probably agree, is the best 3-word description you can find for the rites and prayers of Paul VI and Novus Ordo.
Yes, exactly. So the thing is that does it come from the Catholic Church? Are these people Catholic? That's the next part of the question. And if you say that, well, they are Catholic and do represent the Catholic Church, you run into a little problem of an anathema.
It's not a little problem if you're a Catholic. It's quite. It's a whopper of a problem.
No, indeed, it's not. But who are we to judge, right? As the saying goes.
Well, of course, yeah. Appendix 4 deals with the opposition of, we couldn't possibly have a vacancy of the Holy See that lasts this long.
Yes, and the fact of the matter is that, yes, you can have a vacancy, and that's for a long time, and it doesn't change the nature of the church. So I cite the theologian named Dorsch, who says that. You have other theologians who talk about the state of the church during the vacancy, that they say that the life of the church slows down, as it were, that there are no new manifestations of life in the way of disciplines and doctrines. And in effect, the description that they end up with describes exactly what's going on after Vatican II, that the church continues to exist in those who retain the Catholic faith and Catholic morals, but the life of the church is certainly not vital and active as it was when you had a true pope. So it's that is in fact something that one can see anticipated in the writings of different theologians. Cajetan, I think, talks about that.
Mm-hmm. The fifth appendix, you address the question of where would we get a new pope? Because this is always one that comes up. Where would we get a new pope? Why aren't you conclavists? Then go and elect yourself a new pope. Effectively, there are three theories. First is direct divine intervention. The second is the material formal thesis, or the thesis of Gerard de Laurier. Or the third is an imperfect general council. Could you just briefly explain what these three are?
So, well, there are some different mystics who talk about Peter and Paul appearing, talk about a great apostasy, and Peter and Paul appearing at the end of time to designate a true pope. So these were mystics who, Anna Maria Taigi was one. There are a couple of others I forget. That was one. The other one, the Gerard de Laurier's thesis, basically maintains that, well, if these characters who occupy the various sees, which of course the See of Rome continues to exist, right? The See of Cincinnati continues to exist. So these are creations of ecclesiastical law. Gerard's theory basically was that if you have someone who undergoes a conversion to the Catholic faith, who is a heretic who's occupying the See, then he obtains the pontificate validly. So that was his theory. The other one was Cajetan. And he said that, if the cardinals become extinct, or maybe even if the city of Rome becomes extinct, nevertheless, the church somehow, through an imperfect general council, would have the right to designate her head. The problem is that the theologians who discuss his theory, you get to the point when you turn the page, they don't tell you exactly how this is done. They don't give you the mechanics for it. But nevertheless, again, this demonstrates that theologians who anticipated this possibility. But it's not really. This is not really an objection that you can't figure out where you get a pope, because it doesn't address. It doesn't make heretics popes by default. So the fact that one can't explain this, that one can't project into the future, is not something that, therefore, the guy wearing the clown nose with the communist crucifix, that he becomes the Roman pontiff and send in the clowns. So, but it doesn't. The two things, they're two separate issues. So he doesn't get it. He doesn't get it by default, and you can't prove that. So the thing is that we end up with the life of the church in a practical order, as these theologians describe it, as being sort of circumscribed and small, and no new manifestations officially of the life of the church being able to take place, but nevertheless, the church continues to exist, even though there is this false group of people who present themselves as Catholic.
Well, bring on the clowns is all I can say, Father.
Yeah, it's quite something. I think at one point in the Stuck in a Rut video, if you are attuned to the music for the procession of the cardinals, I think you might just notice that particular theme slipped in somehow in the organ music.
I can't imagine how.
And I can't imagine how either. It would be inconceivable. So,
well, thank you very much, Father. I think that pretty much wraps up our review of this article. Unless you have anything else you'd like to say, or any other comment to make?
At this point, simply that read the material in the pamphlet. The article is, and in the book, where it is now permanently enshrined. It's just something that it's an argument that's easy enough to understand, that if Vatican II is evil, and if it produced error and evil, and this is the result of the officially sanctioned efforts on the part of those who pretend to be our hierarchs, that in fact that logically leads to the judgment or to the deduction that these people cannot in fact represent the authority of the Catholic Church. It's a very simple argument. It's that giant billboard pointing at the post-conciliar popes, flashing and saying, these guys can't possibly be the vicars of Jesus Christ on earth.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, and I would certainly endorse that and say, not that my opinion should go anyway to duel after yours, but I would say go and read this article. It's a very, very good article. Even if you've read it before, go and read it again. Well, that's it then pretty much, Father. May I thank you for being my guest today, and may I also wish you good health and continued success in the work you do at St. Gertrude the Great.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. God bless you all.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Bye now.
Bye-bye. If you have any questions for Father Cekada or feedback on this episode, we would love to hear from you. You can contact us at antimodernist@truerestoration.org, and we will pass along your questions or comments. We would also take this moment to remind you that all correspondence with us is strictly confidential. All of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask that if you found this show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and to your faith, that you please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help make our network worthwhile. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even a simple Ave for our work the next time you pray. For the Restoration, I am Matthew Gaskin. May God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.